Thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm new to the JGI community. My welcome card is through my directorship of the Center for Advanced Bioenergy and Bioproducts Innovation. We're one of 4 bioenergy research centers funded by the Department of Energy. We're the new kids on the block. And just to give you a quick sense of what we're really about and what's unique about it is we really work on the plants as factories paradigm, which is reorganizing plant metabolism to produce high-value products. So I'd love to talk about that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about thinking about how we use land and how that connects to the atmosphere. And so I want you to do a complete reboot, Control-Alt-Delete. We're not doing microns right now. We're going to be in the kilogram and kilometer squared spatial scale. So when we think about what we've got on this planet, this is what we've got, 134 million kilometers of land. That's it, no more, no less. So that's our playground. And currently, we're using about 1/3 of that for agricultural purposes, direct crop production and pasture land. So we have taken over natural ecosystems and converted them into managed ecosystems at about 1/3 of our land. Now, of course, we influence a great deal more than 1/3 of our land, but that's the direct conversion from one land form, one land use to another land use. And that conversion has a direct effect on our atmospheric chemistry. And as we think about the rapid change in carbon dioxide concentrations and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we need to think about how we use land and how it influences that exchange of gases with the atmosphere. Now, this is the big 4. So when we think about converting land into agriculture, almost 90% of that agricultural land is in maize, wheat, soybean, and rice. So it's not a very diverse agricultural system when we look at the planet globally. And the thing I want to draw your attention to with these 4 crops is they're very intensively managed crops. A lot of tillage, a lot of fertilizer inputs, intensive management systems that has some, I mean, don't get me wrong, this is feeding us one way or another, but has some very, very negative ecological consequences. So, any Midwesterners in the room? We heard one talk this morning, a very nice one, okay. So for all you coastal folks, sit in the darn window seat once in a while. Everybody likes the aisle seat. Sit in the window seat and look out. If you look out the flyover states, this is what you're going to see over about 70 million hectares of the United States. This is the single biggest biome type in the United States. This is where I live, not far from Outwood, Illinois, in Champaign-Urbana. And we're talking a lot about diversity this morning. The diversity of this system has a species richness of at least of vascular plants of 2, right? Corn and bean grown in rotation. And how we manage this landscape very dramatically influences our connection and the connection of these landscapes to the climate system. So some of the unfortunate negative consequences of this intensive management system has been a profound loss of soil organic carbon. And that not only decreases soil fertility, but also pumps that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In about the 1860s, John Deere, remember the big green tractors? Well, that's not what he's famous for. What his seminal invention was the self-scouring mow-board plow. This is that plow that looks like the giant front of a battleship and that really turns soil over. And this plow is what made it possible to till the great American prairies. And once we started tilling those prairies and draining those prairies, we aerated them, we stimulated microbial respiration, we lost about 50% of the carbon in those soils in about the first 50 years of tillage. So that's one negative consequences of our current intensive management agricultural systems. Now there may be opportunities with perennial crops, for example, of rebuilding that soil organic carbon. Another negative effect of our intensive management system is the green revolution. The green revolution has been spectacular for feeding an ever-growing human population, but it's been fueled by 2 things. It's been fueled by breeding advances and agronomic advances, but also the application of nitrogen fertilizers. It's about 50-50. Nitrogen fertilizer accounts for about half of the increase in productivity we've seen in the planet. This top graph is worldwide nitrogen fertilizer consumption. Now, some of that nitrogen fertilizer gets denitrified and blows off into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, a very, very potent greenhouse gas. A lot of it's converted into nitrate in the soil. Some of it's taken up by plants. 5, 10, 15, or 20% runs out of these systems into groundwater. Nitrate is highly soluble, runs into drainage ditches, into rivers and streams, and ends up down in the Gulf of Mexico, eutrophying the Gulf of Mexico and causing an enormous dead zone. So these are just a few of the challenges of very intensive agricultural systems. And so how we manage land affects the atmosphere. When we think about that, we think about it sort of in two broad categories of cause and effect relationships. There are biogeochemical processes, so the exchange of CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere. This is sort of the holy trinity of greenhouse gases that are causing the very dramatic warming of the planet. This one is dominated by plant physiological function, photosynthesis, and microbial respiration in soils, very dominated by microbial processes in the soils. And then biophysical effects. The reflectivity of the Earth's surface influences the warming and the temperature of the atmosphere. The amount of evaporative cooling caused by evapotranspiration. So I want to run through three scenarios about how we can manage landscapes. I'm going to focus mostly on these biogeochemical processes. How can we reverse some of the negative biogeochemical processes that are causing and accelerating the warming of our Earth system? And I also want to talk a little bit about nitrate losses and that challenge with the Gulf of Mexico. So how might we start re-envisioning some of our agricultural systems? Well, in 2007, we really launched the bioenergy revolution, and we started thinking about producing ethanol for weaning ourselves from such a strong dependence on fossil fuels, also for revitalizing rural agricultural systems. And that initial phase, and actually the phase that we're currently in up to this date, has relied very heavily on first-generation feedstocks. We're really talking about corn ethanol here. Corn ethanol, of course, perpetuates the challenge of using landscapes in a very intensive way. About 40% of our corn production in the United States goes into your gas tank as ethanol. So it's a big number. When you think about, let me just digress for a minute. Corn, when you think about corn as a food, really it is kind of indirectly, but our current corn production system is 40% going into ethanol, 40% going into animal feed, 20%, a little less than 20%, about 18% going into high fructose corn syrup, and a few percent going into direct human consumption. So it's in the food value chain, but it's not something you pick off the plant and eat, okay? So it's not that kind of food. So can we re-envision using bioenergy crops, particularly second-generation bioenergy crops, for producing energy in a way that's not competitive with the food system and maybe restores some ecosystem goods and services from our heavily managed landscapes. At the University of Illinois, with support from the Department of Energy, we now run the Energy Farm. And it's one of the very few farms in the nation that's dedicated to exploring the genetics, the function, the yields, and my interests, the sustainability issues surrounding second-generation crops. These are mostly perennial crops where we're getting energy either from redirecting carbon metabolism in the plant to high-value products or breaking down lignocellulose into compounds that we want to use for fuel and for bioproducts. In this farm, we're focused mostly on bioenergy crops that are perennial grasses, miscanthus, a very high-yielding grass, a native switchgrass, native prairie, which there isn't any really. We rebuilt native prairie to look at its potential for putting diversity back on the landscape and also getting a provisioning service from it, bioenergy crops. And we will soon be adding to this studies of sorghum also. And so from an ecological perspective, what we're interested in doing is closing the carbon, nitrogen, and hydrologic cycle for all of these crops and comparing it to our control. And our control is that 70 million hectares of the United States that's currently in a corn and bean rotation. So that's the current land use over most of our highly productive agricultural lands in the United States. So I just want to show you a little bit of data about carbon and nitrogen cycling in this system. These plots are very intensely instrumented. This is an eddy covariance tower, which is measuring the exchange of energy, carbon, and water between the land surface and the atmosphere at 20 hertz, about 20 times per second, runs 24/7. We accumulate all those data and integrate them to figure out what the net effect of different land uses is on carbon exchange, for example. And so let me just show you some data on net ecosystem carbon balance. So this is net ecosystem carbon balance is if you add up all the carbon that's coming from the Earth's surface to the atmosphere, and then all the carbon that's going from the atmosphere into the Earth's surface, and get the net of that. And so if it is a negative number, that means it's going into the Earth's surface. If it's a positive number, it means it's going to the atmosphere. And then subtract from that all of the biomass on that landscape that you might use for product. If it's corn, you're taking off the grain. If it's an energy crop, you're harvesting the above ground portions and taking that amount of carbon away. Net ecosystem carbon balance is what's left. And so net ecosystem carbon balance, is the carbon left in the ecosystem, and it should be accrual of soil organic carbon or depletion of soil organic carbon, because that's where it's going to be. And so what you can see from this data set is our maize soybean rotation is in yellow. Our high-yielding miscanthus, switchgrass, and prairie, our potential bioenergy feedstocks, are in green, red, and yellow. And this is during the establishment phase of these crops. And I think what's pretty convincing here is that yellow is almost always positive, and our bioenergy crops are almost always negative. And so what that's telling you is, remember that first John Deere graph I showed you of soil organic carbon depleting by 50% in the first 50 years? Well, there's the depletion, and it's continuing on to this day at about 2 tons per hectare per year coming out of that soil organic carbon. So whatever maize and soybean are doing to the soil, they're causing the microbial community to mine old carbon that's been stored from the establishment of the prairie and continuing to pump that into the atmosphere. Our bioenergy crops not only are producing a product that we can use for energy and bioproduct production, but also because of the perennial nature of these crops, the lack of tillage, and their enormous investment in below ground biomass, they continue to build soil organic carbon. So where's the carbon going? These crops, as I mentioned, they're producing, prairies at the low end at about 5 tons per hectare, 20, 30, 40 tons per hectare in above ground biomass, and equal proportions in below ground biomass. We have cameras that run around in tubes below the ground and measure the development of the root system. And there's enormous investment in below ground biomass in these systems. There's changes in soil textural properties and aggregate structure associated with this. The mycorrhizal fungi associated with this are facilitating storage. How this carbon is stabilized is an open question that we're currently exploring. Okay, I'm sorry to hit you with this awfully busy slide this hour of the morning, but I wanted to introduce it to you to the nitrogen cycle. When you think about the nitrogen cycle in the agricultural landscape, you can't think of the corn nitrogen cycle or the bean nitrogen cycle. You have to think of them as a coupled cycle because we're rotating the 2 crops. Now, here's the experiential learning portion of the lecture. Why do we rotate corn and bean in the United States? Who's got an answer for that one? No one? Nitrogen fixation. The fact that I asked that question means it was a trick question, and that's a very good answer, but it's incorrect. It's exactly what I thought when I moved to the Midwest, that we know bean nodulates, and it's a nitrogen fixer. Actually, it's done to manage soybean cyst nematode and other insect pathogens that live in the soil. So that's why it's really done. And in fact, even though bean is a nitrogen fixer and it's not fertilized in our current agricultural system, it really doesn't even nodulate till halfway through its growing season. And the reason it doesn't nodulate is the nitrogen application is so intense in the previous year's corn that's downregulating nitrogen fixation in the soybean system. So we put an awful lot of fertilizer. This is in kilograms per hectare in the corn system. We don't fertilize the bean system, but this is what's coming over from the previous year. So there's still a lot of nitrogen in that system. There's so much nitrogen in that system that we can almost get equal leaching rates from both systems in terms of losses to groundwater that are fueling that eutrophication of the Gulf of Mexico. And so to study this, next to my PCR machine, not really, that's the kind of equipment you'll find in my laboratory. This is putting in tile drain. Almost all of the Midwest in the central portion of the corn growing belt, the corn belt is drained, okay? And there are these tiles that are below ground that are taking that water away into drainage ditches, and as I mentioned, down into rivers and down into the Mississippi and down into the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we put in new tile drain so we could capture the water that was coming out of our crop systems. And so we have little well houses. And in those well houses, this is from each of our different crops, we have samplers that can sample groundwater, measure the amount of water that's flowing through the system, and take samples for us so that we can do chemistry on those samples. And I just want to show you some information about the nitrate losses from these various types of crops during the establishment phase. So here's our corn bean system through time, the yellow. Here's our establishment year, a replanting year, and then successive years. And this is the nitrate concentration in the groundwater. Just disturbing the system causes nitrogen to mineralize and produce nitrate that comes out of the system. But here's corn. Actually, this is corn. This is a bean year, a corn year. And look at our perennial crops through time. High, getting lower, to the point where we're almost at detection limits by the 6th year of the experiment. So these perennial crops, even though we're fertilizing them, have very, very tight nitrogen cycles. Because they're perennial, they're retranslocating a lot of that nitrogen into their rhizomes and storing it for the successive year. We do fertilize at much lower rates. But even the amount we are fertilizing is being very, very efficiently used by the crop. So by perennializing our agricultural landscapes, we almost eliminate nitrate losses to groundwater. And it's the same story. I don't have the data. I have the data, but I don't want to show it to you now because of time. But it's the same story for nitrous oxide emissions to the atmosphere. The graph would look very similar. Virtually no N2O emissions after a couple of years of fertilization in our perennial crops. So that's vignette one. I want to show you two more vignettes about how we might improve management in our agricultural landscapes. This is my nuts and berries story. So why are we growing corn and bean? I already told you that these are not crops we eat. They're not eat in the sense that we pick off the plant and chew on. They're crops that make products that are then used in the food value chain. Are there alternatives? And so one alternative I want you to think about is perennial polyculture systems, woody polyculture systems, like alley cropping, where we purposely grow trees and herbaceous plants together to produce food in a way that might be environmentally more sustainable. If we can mix species, we know we can more efficiently use resources like sunlight, water, and available nutrients. So that's kind of the idea. This is a system that's been around for quite a long time, but not for food production. It's mostly been thought of as a forestry producing system. So this is a typical alley cropping system where you see trees and in the intervening spaces herbaceous plants. Sometimes it's maize, sometimes it's pasture. So this is a fantastic paper, by the way. I really encourage you to look at it. It was by John Foley. Came out a very long time ago, but it's a beautiful conceptual framework for thinking about how we use land and how that land influences the ecosystem, the ecological goods and services we get from that land. And so here's a natural landscape, and we can see here's its value for forest production, for preserving habitat, for regulating services like regulating the amount of water flow, carbon storage. Fantastic system with one exception. Not much in the crop production, nothing much to eat in that system. Of course, here's our current crop production system, great at producing grain, but not so good at all the other ecosystem services. So can we think about a polyculture system that relies on the intentional growth of woody plants and herbaceous plants to optimize the whole show? So that's kind of where we're going with this work. And so we've started a farm at the University of Illinois, at my nuts and berries farm, where we're growing in row crop systems, food-producing trees and vines all together, grapes and currants, hazelnuts and chestnuts, all together in rows with pasture in between. And we're looking at the calories we can get from that system, and we're also looking at the ecosystem services we can get from that system. Now, I just want to go back to this concept of corn and soybean as food again. So here's what we really get from corn. We're getting carbohydrate, a little bit of protein, and a little bit of oil. Well, here's what you get from chestnut. Carbohydrate, protein, and oil. Looks like a pretty good substitute to me if you're squeezing these things to get these compounds out of them. Here's what we're getting from soybean. Protein, carbohydrate, and oil. Here's what we're getting from hazelnut. Protein, carbohydrate, and oil. So these might be fungible resources. So what if we start growing them together? And so we just started this research at Illinois. So here's our row cropping system. We're growing pasture in the middle. So these are little trees now. And they're being very heavily fertilized early on. They will not be so heavily fertilized as they mature. And the very preliminary data I want to show you is just the nitrogen losses from these systems. It gives how much nitrogen, how much of that fertilizer that's being applied is flowing out the bottom. And what you can see in our soybean and maize system, there's a lot of nitrate loss. And in our perennial system, very, very low nitrogen losses. We don't have data on carbon exchange yet from this system. We've just put eddy covariance towers over it so we can start measuring that too. So these data are sort of very, very preliminary data about the early establishment phase of this cropping system. Now the question always arises, well, so can you get enough? I mean, can you get enough calories from this kind of system to feed people? And so Probably not, at least right now, but I think it's possible. So here's the historic caloric yields of maize and soybean in the rotation system, and here's our current modern yields. And here's what we project we might get from that field experiment I showed you if we let it go for 20 years. Here's our production system. So we might be getting about a third of the yields that we're currently seeing from our maize and soybean system. But remember, these crops are almost completely unimproved genetically. There's been no effort really to maximize yields from these types of crops. So, I don't know if we'll get there, but we might get here. And we might get there on more marginal lands, providing a great deal of sustainability and resilience for the farming system in the Midwest. Okay, I'm sorry for the quality of this graph. This is the last vignette I want to give you, and this is going to be some sort of way out stuff. This is a dirty little story that most people don't think about that's going to come and bite us pretty soon if we're not very careful about it. So this is our net CO2 emissions for the planet, and this graph is the mean of the ensemble models for the RCP 2.6 scenario. In other words, this is the scenario we need to follow if we're to keep increases in global average temperature at 2 degrees centigrade or below, which is our goal. So we have to reduce emissions. CO2 has an atmospheric lifetime of 80 to 100 years, and we have to start scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if we're going to meet this RCP 2.6 standard of a goal of reducing or maintaining warming at about 2 degrees centigrade, we're going to have to come up with ways of scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. This is the part nobody talks about. We've got to get CO2 that's currently in the atmosphere out. Well, how do we do that? There are a number of scenarios that are being put forward. One that I think has some pretty good potential is called BECCS. This is bioenergy, carbon capture and sequestration. That's growing bioenergy crops, using them for electricity generation and fuel production, capturing in the flue stack that CO2 and injecting it below ground. And there's some feasibility studies that are underway that we got to scale up really fast if we're going to make this happen that suggests that this might work. Of course, planting new forest is a very good way of scrubbing CO2 out of the atmosphere. There are also schemes for direct CO2 scrubbing, capture, using biochar and soil sequestration, fertilizing our oceans to increase ocean uptake. All of these are pretty scary things that we wouldn't have even I wouldn't have even had the nerve to show you this stuff a few years ago, but we're getting to the point where we've got to get very serious about these kinds of scenarios. One that we're exploring is enhanced weathering. So you know that in our atmosphere, carbon dioxide combines with water vapor to make carbonic acid. That carbonic acid rains down on silicate and calcium-bearing basalt rocks and causes them to weather. That's a very natural process, been going on from the beginning of time, and it's actually been a rheostat controlling CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere since there were rocks and rain. And so we're looking at this weathering process and asking the question, can we accelerate it? So here's the process. Carbonic acid is formed in the atmosphere. It attacks basalts and other calcium-rich rocks. Those rocks weather, liberating calcium, which forms bicarbonate, which goes into aqueous solution, flows out in groundwater into ocean waters, and is sequestered in deep ocean. So that's kind of the idea. That's what's happening. Can we accelerate the process? Now this is getting kind of scary. Accelerate rock weathering. Okay. So what are we talking about when we talk about accelerating weathering or enhanced weathering processes? So this is our current CO2 emissions globally. Here's what we're getting from land use change, coal combustion, oil, gas, and others. We're emitting about 10 gigatons of carbon per year. Natural weathering caused by rock weathering, this process I just described to you, is sequestering about half a gigaton per year. Are there ways that we can get tenfold increases in weathering that are reasonable and affordable and sustainable? And so how do you increase weathering? You increase temperature and you increase surface to area ratio. So can we apply rock in our agricultural systems in warm areas to enhance the weathering process? And will that be effective without killing our crops in accelerating the weathering scheme? And so, so we tried it. And so we got some funding. and we're trying an enhanced weathering project at the University of Illinois. And so this is a basalt rock. Now, before you think I'm just totally out to lunch here, we have a tradition of putting rock on fields in the United States, right? We lime our fields. So this is not something that's outside of the agricultural management practice. It's not something that's economically completely wacky. Of course, there's been no life cycle analysis yet to see if we're not spending more CO2 grinding and transporting rock than we're saving, but that's to come. So we just started this research this year. We started by getting a lot of basalt, and this is this is again the kind of equipment you'll find in my laboratory at the University of Illinois, spreading it on fields, and we're doing it at farm scale. Okay, so this is the same spreader that we use to put lime on fields. And so the data I'm going to show you are relative to the nitrogen cycle, not the carbon cycle, because again, we're just starting this research, and these were easy data to get. What we started to observe, so this was a small test plot, meter squared plot, and this is a whole field scale manipulation, and this is the nitrous oxide emission coming from those fields. And what you can see is that here's our control line and our basalt line for cumulative nitrous oxide emissions. Basalt is lowering nitrous oxide emissions in these systems. Well, that's kind of a weird result unless you think about some of the knock-on effects of weathering. We're putting more calcium in the system. We're raising the pH. Higher pH suppresses nitrous oxide emissions. So we may, in time, see more carbon storage and start looking at bicarbonate in our water system that's leaving. We haven't done that yet. But there may be some ancillary benefits to this system. These are also silicaceous rocks. We're liberating a lot of silica into the system, and silica is a very effective anti-herbivore defense in plants. So there may be some other benefits. So it's kind of crazy. It's a wild idea. But I think the time is right to start thinking about these wild ideas because we are heading to a tipping point. So what I want to leave you with today is how we use our land systems directly affects the climate system. And that can be a good thing if we think about intentionally engineering practices that help sequester carbon in land systems. In the right place at the right time, I think bioenergy crops and my nuts and berries story, production agroforestry, might provide the provisioning services that we want from our ecosystems, food, oil, protein, and carbohydrates, and also provide some regulating services, tightening up the nitrogen cycle and sequestering soil organic carbon. If we're going to meet our target of staying below 2 degrees C warming, we've got to come up with some technologies, and maybe my story isn't the way to go, but we've got to come up with some technologies in the next 10 years that are going to actively and aggressively reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. I don't think it's too soon to be thinking about the dirty G word. A long time ago, as in 5 years ago, ecologists wouldn't even mention the word geoengineering. But it's time to start thinking about geoengineering strategies if we're going to pair it with dramatic reductions in emissions to the atmosphere to control our climate system. Well, this work was funded by the Energy Biosciences Institute in collaboration with folks here at LBL and at Berkeley, a DOE Sun Grant initiative. The Leverhulme Trust, Leverhulme, this is Lever Brothers, is keenly interested in environmental issues and is supporting our work on enhanced weathering. And of course, our new center, CABI, will be looking at a lot of these sustainability issues in the context of bioenergy as we move forward. So thank you very much for your attention and this talk at different scales.